I've done a lot of talking in this class about how to build all the chords you're going to see in a lead sheet. And then once you see that chord, what kind of a scale goes along with it, be it one of the modes or a blues scale or a pentatonic scale, anything like that. So we always know it's safe to use the chord tones when we're improvising on a chord. The problem is that sometimes there's not enough color. We've only got, say, 3 or 4 notes to improvise with, and that's where the modes kind of helped us out. We now got an additional 3 or 4 tones that we could use to improvise on, and that helped us out. But then we started finding out, well, there's some of those notes that are avoid tones, or there's some of those notes that you don't want to emphasize, or there's other notes you don't want to land on one. And so that was sort of the beginnings of what we call chord-scale relationship. Here's a chord, and here's a scale that I can use. Here's the C major 7th, here's an Ionian mode. Here's an E-flat dominant 7th, here's the E-flat Mixolydian mode. Well, even as early as the early jazz style period, the early jazz style period with Louis Armstrong and Sidney Bechet and great improvisers like that, they not only would use chord tones, but they would start embellishing on those chord tones in different ways. And that's what we're going to talk about in this unit. We're going to talk about neighbor tones. What neighbor tones are is if we have a chord we're improvising on, we not only can use those chord tones, but we can use the little chromatic neighbor tones that are, or the diatonic neighbor tones that are right around that chord tone. So here's the topic that we're talking about. Neighbor tones. So what we're saying is, if we have a C major 7th chord, where the notes are C, E, G, and B, instead of thinking, okay, there's the notes of a C major 7th chord, what scale? Why don't I just use those chord tones but just embellish around them a little bit? So here I have my C major 7th chord, and I have, and this gets boring for me quickly. What about if I start embellishing around the chord tones? What I'm playing right now is not a scale. A lot of people listen to those notes and say, what scale is that you're playing? That's a really cool scale. Well, it's not a scale at all. All I'm doing is taking the chord tones of a C major triad or a C major 7th and embellishing on it with the tones that are just around it. Here's another example. Sometimes you can mix it in with just the chord tones. And then mix some neighbor tones in there. Okay, so that's the idea, that's the concept we're going for in this one. Not a new scale, but how do you just take the chord tones and embellish those chord tones? Now this idea of neighbor tones goes clear back to the Baroque period with composers like George Frederick Handel and Johann Sebastian Bach and Bach's sons and Domenico and Alessandro Scarlatti. They started seeing that you could take not only a major scale in the chord tones, but you could start chromatically embellishing on those chord tones to get interesting melodies. When you study traditional music theory, we not only talk about neighbor tones, which we're going to talk about in a minute here, but other kinds of what we call non-harmonic tones, like passing tones, appoggiaturas, escape tones, suspensions, retardations, so on and so forth. Jazz musicians use these things, however, probably a lot of jazz musicians don't realize they're using them because this whole concept of non-harmonic tones, neighbor tones, and appoggiaturas and the like is reasonably academic, and a lot of jazz musicians don't come from that academic background. So they hear these things happening in classical music when they're quoting a classical piece, when they're inventing a melody that comes through an African-American musical tradition or a European tradition. They're using these things that have deeply embedded in our musical fabric, and they're just hearing those things. However, we're going to talk about specifically about what they're doing today when they play some of those lines that I just played for you right now. So first we're going to talk about one specific kind of neighbor tone, and that's called the chromatic lower neighbor tone. The chromatic lower neighbor tone. Now, all a neighbor tone is one alphabet letter away from the tone that you're currently on. So if I'm on a C, a neighbor tone is a B or a D. If I'm on an E, my neighbor tones are D and F. If I'm on a G, my neighbor tones are F and A. And if I'm on a B, my neighbor tones are A and C, of course. All right, so the chromatic lower neighbor tone, what we're going to talk about is the neighbor tones that are just one alphabet letter south, you might say, of each of these chord tones. So my neighbor tones to the south of C, my neighbor tone is going to be B. And my neighbor tone south of E is going to be D. And my neighbor tone south of G is going to be F, and from B is going to be A. But when we talk about a chromatic neighbor tone, we're actually talking about one half step. It must be one half step away. So the chromatic lower neighbor tone to C is B, but the chromatic lower neighbor tone to E is D sharp. The chromatic lower neighbor tone to G is actually going to be F sharp. And the chromatic lower neighbor tone to B is actually going to be A sharp. So does this give me a new scale now that I can improvise with? Let's listen to this scale that we've just got up here on the board. Now here's my chord. Does that sound like a new scale? Well, there sounds like there's some good parts to it, but there's also some parts that sound kind of funny. If I were just to improvise on this using it as a scale, this kind of exotic B-looking scale, some of the notes would sound good, but some would sound kind of funny. If I just randomly try to make melodies up on it, I can make it sound pretty good, or I can make it sound pretty bad. Okay, what we're going for here is not to make it sound bad. We're trying to make it sound good. So don't think of this new collection of pitches as a new scale. We're looking at the black pitches here, C, E, G, and B, as our home tones, as our chord tones. And we're looking at the blue tones here as our neighbor tones, the ones that we're using to embellish the chord tones. So what you'd always want to do is look for those black tones, the C, E, G, and B, to be the home tones that you are trying to get to. We're actually just trying to embellish those four, and we're using the blue tones, B, D sharp, F sharp, and A sharp, to embellish those. So in other words, just like when you were a kid and Mom said that you had to be home by a certain time, we're always trying to get home. We're using these neighbor tones to get us home. So we're going to do something like, we might use that B to embellish the C, and the D sharp to embellish the E, and the G sharp to embellish the A. That can be in the way of a grace note, and the A sharp to embellish the B. So grace notes would sound something like this. That's all right, but you can run it in a eighth note line as long as you make sure that the chord tones are happening on the beats. A 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that's what we call that unaccented neighbor tones. That's a little bit more specific than we want to get right here. Let's go ahead and I'll write a little melodic line here using the tones of the C major seventh and these neighbor tones, these chromatic neighbor tones. Here's my little melodic line. A 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's all the notes of those four tones of the C major seventh plus all the neighbor tones. Here underlined in red are my neighbor tones. Okay, and you can see that I've got my chord tones happening on the beat. C, C, E, E, G, G, B, B. In fact, if I just unembellish this line, it would sound something like this. But now with those little neighbor tones, it sounds like this. Okay, so that's the idea of neighbor tones. Let's look at example number 1. It gives you an F7. And so with an F7, my chord tones are going to be F, A, C, and E flat. And my chromatic lower neighbor tones are going to be E, G sharp, B, and D. So we've got this. Now if I play a little line, a little melodic line in example 2, I get something that sounds like this. Yeah, that's nice. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now what you can see is in the first part of that excerpt, we've got the chord tones happening on the beats like we talked about. In the second part of the excerpt, though, you can see that the neighbor tones are actually happening on the beats, and the chord tones are happening on the weak parts of the beat. Okay. You can do this too. After a little bit of messing around with the neighbor tones and the chord tones for a while, you start to get a comfort level of what sounds good. When we put those neighbor tones on the beat, we call them accented. So that would be called an accented chromatic lower neighbor. I wouldn't get too worried about all the technical jargon and everything with this right now. Just start messing around with neighbor tones and just kind of get a feel for it and see what you come up with. But this is our first neighbor tone, the chromatic lower neighbor tone. Now, just like we have when we're at home, we have a neighbor on our left side and we have a neighbor to our right. So right now this is our downstairs neighbor right now, the chromatic lower neighbor tone. Let's talk about the upstairs neighbor, and that's the guy who lives 1/2 step above us. So let's go back to our C major 7th chord and experiment and get to know the guy who lives 1/2 step floor above us, if you want to use that analogy. Here's our C, E, G, and B. So now we're going to talk about the chromatic upper neighbor. Chromatic upper neighbor is the guy who lives 1/2 step above us. So the chromatic upper neighbor tone to C is D flat. And the chromatic upper neighbor tone to E is F. And the chromatic upper neighbor tone to G is A flat. And the chromatic upper neighbor tone to B is C. Is that a new scale? What same concept? Don't think of this as a scale. Actually, that's kind of a neat sounding scale. I think that might be called some kind of Hungarian scale. And that does sound actually okay on a C major 7. Although it wouldn't probably be your first choice. I'd wait a while before you get into some of those more exotic scales on improvising. What we're looking at here, though, is our chord tones in black again, C, E, G, and B, and then our neighbor tones in blue, those chromatic neighbor tones. These are called the chromatic upper neighbor tones. So once again, don't think of this as a new scale. I can make this sound pretty good. Okay, or I can make it sound pretty bad. So we don't want it to sound bad. Again, what you're talking about here is you're using these blue tones to embellish the black tones. So I'd want to start by using my chord tones, going to a neighbor tone, and then coming back to the chord tone again. Okay? All right. So let's create a little melodic line using the upper neighbor tones this time. Chromatic upper neighbor tones. Okay, so here I'm going to go ahead and underline the chromatic upper neighbor tones on the beats. There's my chord tones, and now in between I've got kind of an interesting sound. On major 7ths, I don't know that I'd use these chromatic upper neighbors a whole lot, but on other types of chords, they sound pretty good. The example, if you look at example number 4, it gives you the idea of what a line could sound like on a B flat major 7th chord. Let's go ahead and hear what that sounds like. Kind of an exotic, interesting sound, but the idea is you're emphasizing the home tones. Don't create a new scale. Don't just arbitrarily start now emphasizing all of the neighbor tones. keep emphasizing the home tones and use the neighbor tones as embellishment. Remember, if you're on a neighbor tone, you need to go to the home tone first before you go off someplace else. So for example, if I want to emphasize this D flat, and that's a neighbor tone, I need to go to C first before I skirt off and go to another neighbor tone. Don't just explore off on all the neighbor tones and just touch on the home tones every once in a while. Now you can develop kind of an interesting line, quite interesting line, by using combinations of both chromatic upper and lower neighbor tones. Let's look at the example number 5 there. It gives us a G minor 7th chord. G minor 7th. Okay, and here's my notes here. G, B flat, D, and F. And now we're going to look at both of them kind of being used together. So my chromatic lower neighbor tones are half step below each of these. F sharp, A, C sharp, and E. And my chromatic upper neighbor tones are a half step above each of these. A flat, B natural, E flat, and I guess we'll call it F sharp. Why not? Okay. So now we're going to mess around with the G minor 7th chord, but also sort of see what we can find with the neighbor tones around each of those. So if I play this as a scale, I get this. Okay. So am I saying now that virtually the chromatic scale is a cool scale to use on a G minor 7th chord? Well, not really. I'm not saying that now you can just go ahead and arbitrarily, however you feel like it, use the notes of a chromatic scale. When you get to become an experienced improviser, you'll find that and you'll also find that the greatest improvisers in the world can use any tone on any chord and make it sound good, but it's how they approach it and how they resolve it that make them sound so great. So sure, there will be a time when you can just use any of these tones however you want, but right now we're going to make sure that we resolve all of these red and green notes appropriately to the chord tones. So what we're saying here is that the F sharp and the A flat embellish the G. So I could start on the F sharp, go to the G, go to the A flat, and back to the G. As long as I get to my chord tone last before I go off someplace else. I could also start on my lower, go up to my upper, and come back to my tone. I could start on the upper, go to the lower, and come to my chord tone. All kinds of combinations. Start with the tone, lower, tone, upper, tone. How about tone, lower, upper, tone? So you can see there's all kinds of combinations, but you could always hear when I was describing those different combinations, I always ended with the tone itself before I went off. Also, you don't have to go straight up the chord. It doesn't have to go G, B flat, D, F. You can start with the root, go to the 5th, come to the 3rd, go to the 7th. 7th, 3rd, 3rd, 1, 5th, 3rd, 1. All I'm doing is embellishing those chord tones with the neighbor tones. Let's look at the example that's right here on exercise number 6. That's an example of chromatic lower neighbors and chromatic upper neighbors put together in a nice combination that works on a G minor 7th. One more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that gives us our first two neighbor tones, chromatic lower and chromatic upper neighbor tones. Now, there's really two other types of neighbor tones, and that's not the neighbors that are a half step away. These are the neighbors that are the next one up in the scale. For example, let's stay on G minor for a second. I'm going to erase my neighbors, get those upper and lower neighbor tones out of there. All right. So here I am at my G minor 7th chord. Now, what's the scale that would be most appropriate for a G minor 7th chord? Well, we've done a lot of talking about Dorian and Phrygian and Aeolian and all that stuff. But really remember, when we have a G minor 7th chord, more than likely it's functioning like a 2. So we're going to say that the Dorian mode is probably the most common functional mode for this chord. So if I were to fill in the gaps of the Dorian mode here, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, F, and then up again to G, what I've just put here in red are the next note up in the scale. And if you start on a tone itself and embellish that tone with the next tone up in the scale, we get our next type of neighbor tone, which are called diatonic upper neighbors. The diatonic upper neighbor is the next tone up in the scale of the chord, of the moment. So if I'm in a G minor 7th chord and I'm on my G, the diatonic upper neighbor is A. From the B flat, the diatonic upper neighbor is C. That's a whole step. This is a whole step. From D, the next tone up in the scale is E. That's a whole step. And the next tone up from an F would be a G. So these are all whole steps higher. Are the diatonic upper neighbors always a whole step higher? Well, no, they're not. We'll find some examples where they aren't every once in a while. But you can see how we can also embellish the tones of a G minor 7th with the diatonic upper neighbors. Start on the home tone, go to the diatonic upper neighbor, and come back. Let's go back to a C major 7th and do those. C major 7, C, E, G, and B. And my diatonic upper neighbors then are going to be D, F, A, and C. A couple things happened on this one. First of all, I've got C, E, G, and B. My diatonic upper neighbors. Well, look at a couple things here. The diatonic upper neighbor to C is D. That's a whole step. But the diatonic upper neighbor to E is F. That's a half step. So what we're kind of saying is at times the diatonic upper neighbor is going to be a half step and sometimes a whole step. In other words, the diatonic upper neighbor tone is E, from E is F, but the chromatic upper neighbor tone from E is also F. A whole step up from G is A, that's our diatonic, and the diatonic upper neighbor tone from B is C. Well, that's both a half step, and it's our chromatic upper neighbor, and it's our diatonic upper neighbor, as well as being a chord tone itself. Let's look at example number 8. Gives an example of a melodic line using diatonic upper neighbors. We've got some of that sounds pretty good. Some of it sounds a little bland, probably because there's no chromaticism going on here at all. It's all notes of the scale. But at least we've got some variety going here, and we can hear very clearly we're embellishing notes of the chord. Now you can see that between these three, we've got the diatonic upper neighbors, DUNs. We've got the chromatic upper neighbors, CUNs. And we've got the chromatic lower neighbors, CLNs. And we can start to mix these three up quite a bit. Let's see what we got here. This is going to be a pretty interesting scale when I put all those up here. Let's see if I can do it in different colors also. Let's see, the chromatic lower neighbor tone to C is B. Chromatic lower neighbor tone to E is D sharp. The chromatic lower neighbor tone to G is F sharp. And the chromatic lower neighbor tone to B is A sharp. And then we've also got our chromatic upper neighbor tones. Let's see, the chromatic upper neighbor tone to C is C sharp. Chromatic upper neighbor tone to E is F. The chromatic upper neighbor tone to G is A flat. Having a hard time squeezing all these in. Chromatic upper neighbor tone to B is C. And now you can see with all of these neighbor tones, we've in effect got this. We're seeing that on a C major 7th chord, it is possible to use all the notes of the chromatic scale. It's just how you use them to embellish chord tones that makes the difference between someone that sounds good using the chromatic scale and someone that sounds like they're just meandering around the C major scale. Let's look at example number 9. This gives us a G dominant 7th chord. Well, let's figure out all of the different types of neighbor tones on a G dominant 7th chord. G, B, D, and F. We've got G, B, D, and F. Let's see here. Now, the diatonic neighbor tones would be A, C, E, and back up to G. Those are the diatonics. The chromatic lower neighbor tones would be F sharp, G sharp. No, I'm sorry about that. The chromatic lower neighbor tones to the chord tones would be F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, and I guess E would be right there, right? Chromatic lower neighbor tone would also be E here. All right, and now let's figure out the chromatic upper neighbor tones. To G would be A flat, to B would be C, we've got that one already. To D would be E flat, and to F would be G flat. Okay, so there's all our neighbor tones. Okay, kind of a strange exercise, but we know here, there's our G, our chromatic lower neighbor tones, our chromatic upper neighbor tones, and our diatonic neighbor tones. Okay, and put them all together in a variety of different ways. Look at exercise number 9, or example number 9. There's all your notes of a G7, and we've got it embellished using all the different types of neighbor tones. One more time for me, thanks. 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, for the most part, you can see that the G, B, D, and F are happening on the beats. For example, the second half of the first measure, and the second half of the second measure, and pretty much all of the melody for the rest of the way out. But occasionally it can work to put the chord tones in between the beats and the neighbor tones first. That's what's happening at the beginning of the first measure and at the beginning of the second measure. Now, at the bottom of the page, you can see all kinds of different neighbor tones used in all kinds of combinations. Remember, the idea, though, is that you want to end up on the chord tone. You're circling around the chord tone. You want to end up on that chord tone before you jump off someplace else. If C is the note that you're embellishing, you want to make sure that you end up on C before you jump off someplace else. There, I went to G, and I embellished all around G, but I ended on G before I jumped someplace else. So here's the chromatic lower neighbor tones, chromatic upper neighbor tones, diatonics, chromatic lower neighbor tone and chromatic upper neighbor tone, chromatic lower neighbor tone and diatonic upper neighbor tone, chromatic lower neighbor tone and chromatic upper neighbor tone. Let's see, I'm sorry about this. How about chromatic lower neighbor tone and diatonic upper neighbor tone? And then all kinds of combinations. You can see towards the end of the page we're getting all kinds of interesting combinations. But let's write a little melodic line. Let's use G7 since G7's up on the board. I'll write a little melodic line using the notes of a G7 and the neighbor tones. Okay, 4/4 time. See what we got here. Okay, now we're going to look at the tones that are in the chord. G, 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 B, B, D, and G. This is on a G dominant 7th chord. All right? So what have we got here? Right here we've got our chromatic lower neighbor tone, whereas right here we've got a chromatic upper neighbor tone. The C, actually this is an interesting one here because the C to the B, we've got a diatonic upper neighbor tone going to a chromatic lower neighbor tone. This D, C sharp to the D is a chromatic lower neighbor tone, and the F sharp up to the G is another chromatic lower neighbor tone. So we've embellished notes of a G dominant 7th chord with a bunch of different chromatic neighbor tones. Let's listen to that one more time. And it's really fun to experiment with different types of neighbor tones on different types of chords. So I hope you have fun messing around with it too. It gets to be kind of a complicated process, but if you just start simple with just chromatic lower neighbor tones, you can get a lot of mileage out of that. Louis Armstrong is a great example of getting a lot of mileage out of just triad tones and just a few little neighbor tones.